Welcome, everyone. I know we've got a few people trickling in, but we wanted to keep on our schedule. Good morning. My name is Mike Petro. I'm the Executive Vice President of CED, and welcome to our Fall Policy Conference. This is the very first session of what will be a fun-packed day for all of us. We've got, after this breakfast, a trustee briefing, and then we will continue with the full conference at lunch in the Willard room here at the hotel. I am pleased that we're starting this discussion around higher education. CED has been a leader in the area of post-secondary education for decades. Most recently, CED published research on apprenticeships, as well as developed recommendations for reauthorizing the Higher Ed Act, which governs most post-secondary policies and programs in the United States. So starting off with this discussion aligns very well with the history of our business leaders who have traditionally believed that they are the consumers of the system, not just at the highest levels, but through K through 12 and the earliest years as well. So we're really pleased. We're doubly pleased that we have former CED trustee Steve Trachtenberg here, along with his colleague Gerald Kauvar, to talk about their book, Leading Colleges and Universities. I might also add that Gordon Gee, a CED trustee, is one of the co-authors, and we're real pleased that Gordon couldn't make it, but he sends his regards, and Gordon actually came to Capitol Hill over the summer, and we brought him around, and he regaled everyone and did a terrific job of representing CED. Steve Trachtenberg is notorious. He's a legend in the world of higher education. He is the president and university emeritus at George Washington University. He served as the university's president it was the 15th president, I believe, and for nearly 2 decades. And Gerry Kauvar is a research professor of public policy and public administration at George Washington University, and he serves as the special assistant to Steve. And he was, when Steve was the president at GW. I'm going to ask our speakers to come up and just talk about the book and what it means, and what it means especially for the business community. I will say I had the opportunity many years ago to the National Education Association put together a luncheon at their headquarters, and we brought CED trustees along with labor leaders, and Steve Trachtenberg blew everyone out of the water. He was clearly the smartest guy in the room and represented our organization so well. So we are so happy and proud to have Steve back. And Gerry, of course, it's good to make your acquaintance, and we're pleased that you're here to talk about your book. And I don't know how we want to. Steve, you want to come up first? Or we're going to do Gerry first? Okay. All right, Gerry Kauvar.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I appreciate the opportunity. We're going to save the best for last, so I'm going first. What do we have here? I mean, what is this book? Leading doesn't mean ranking, okay? It's a verb and not an adjective. So it's a book of about 310 pages. It's the second one that Steve and I have published with Johns Hopkins. The first one is called Presidencies Derailed. And what that book was about was presidents who lost their jobs. This book is by and about successful presidents, some of whom also lost their jobs, and a few other people. A chair of the Faculty Senate, a former president of the American Association of University Professors, the head of the Council on Accreditation for Higher Education. And the book itself is divided into 4 parts: getting started, internal challenges, external challenges, and personal challenges. Within each part, several topics are addressed. In general, what we did was to ask 2 university presidents, 2 contributors, from different types of institutions to address each of the 30 or so topics. For example, the section on getting started includes becoming a president, the transition to the position, building a team for collective success, balancing skills and temperaments on a leadership team, maintaining good relationships with the board, developing relationships with faculty and staff, and delegating authority. These are not just books, in other words, for university presidents. They're also about, I think, almost anybody in any line of work. Each contributor was also asked to provide candid responses to 5 questions. What do you wish you had known before you took the job? What do you wish you had done that you didn't do? What do you wish you hadn't done that you did do? What do you wish you hadn't known when you finished? And how did you know when it was time to stop? My favorite answer to that last question was when they changed the locks on the doors. In addition, President Emeritus Trachtenberg and President Gordon Gee of West Virginia University, and I don't have a title anymore. I consider myself an extinguished professor. We wrote a preface. We wrote an essay on intercollegiate athletics, one on institutional autonomy, and a closing essay based on the answers people provided to those 5 questions. That's what the book is. It's also frequently witty, forthright, revelatory about the individuals who accepted our invitations to contribute. What it isn't is a primer on how to be a successful president. Anyone attempting to write a book like that is in search of a unicorn. Some proposed topics were radioactive. That is, no one would agree to write about them. For example, the president's role in shaping the budget, or the role, if any, in curricular additions and deletions. If you consider buying the book, please recall that Steve and I are no longer employed at GW, and we do get royalties to replace our salary, and I think the royalties altogether allow us a pizza a week if we don't have too many toppings on it. At any rate, both books, The Presidency's Derailed and Leading Higher Education, are available to you at a discount should you like one, and we've got flyers to tell you how to get them. Let me talk a little bit about some of the topics that the council asked us to speak about. One of them was how well the colleges and universities prepare people for the world of work. Not very well. Let me tell you why. The world of work, and I call it the world of shirk. For example, in one, that is work as opposed to the academy, you show up on time. You can't be tardy, and you can't miss a day. In your world, there's no grade of incomplete. There's no grade inflation. There are few excused absences. You don't have any fraternity or sorority pals to help you with old files of examinations, or get you a fake Florida driver's license so that you can drink. They can't introduce you to wealthy parents or deny that you were drunk or disorderly. You don't have any tolerance for drug or alcohol abuse. In your world, nobody can get away with plagiarism of any sort. A missed assignment can't be made up. Internships are more than resume decoration. Work is year-round with appropriate leave policies. No summers off, no spring vacations. You don't have maids to clean your bedroom or your bathroom. It's unlikely that there will be lazy rivers or athletics or museums or theaters. There's at least a 40-hour work week. You'll pay for your own medical insurance. In other words, no more 4-year loaf on the old man's dough. So the cultures of universities are not the same as the cultures in the world of work. So in that way, I don't think we prepare people very well for the world of work. We're also, none of us, particularly good at figuring out what the job market is going to look like in 5 years. It's changing dramatically and rapidly. New careers all the time. Probably when most of us were in school, we were told we had to take calculus if we were going to be successful. No, you got to take coding now. And you better take it soon because your world's going to depend on that. We're not very good at universities at being nimble because of our governance structure. We have what's called shared governance. That is, we share it with the board and with the faculty, even though we are presumably administrative leaders. If you read our books, if you read the newspapers, you'll find that boards are really difficult for presidents. Many of you have read recently about the University of Maryland and the problems there, where the board, I think, made some very bad decisions, tried to force the president out. Athletics seemed to take prominence over education, and the board essentially had to be renewed. That's not uncommon. When you read either book about successful presidents or unsuccessful presidents, what you find is that often that success is in lack of ability to get along with the board members, to get clear instruction from the board members, to have role delineation between the board and the president, who is responsible for what. Talking about leadership just for a minute. There's no rule for leadership. There's no magic formula. Somerset Maugham said that there are 3 rules for writing a successful novel. The trouble is that nobody knows what they are. I think the same is true about leadership. What are you going to say? The golden rule, Kant's moral imperative, honored more in the breach than in the observance. After all, if somebody doesn't know how to treat other people, they have probably failed long before they became a president. So even the Hippocratic Oath, do no harm. That's probably good advice for everybody, but if you've ever read the Hippocratic Oath, that's not the end of it. There's a lot more to it than simply that. I only know of one rule that seems to be universal, and it was attributed to Conrad Hilton. In a bath, the curtain goes outside. In a shower, the curtain goes inside. That's probably not going to help you very much, but it's the only rule I know that's sort of universal. Leading is contextual and it's situational. If you read a lot of books on leadership, you know that. Here's what happens. It's you play golf. Anybody, do you play golf here? Get a golf magazine, and it monthly tells you how to cure your slice. And every month the advice is different. There is no way to cure your slice because your golf stroke depends on so many things. It depends on your body temperature, on your whether you got enough sleep last night, your body chemistry, your blood chemistry, your urine chemistry, your metabolism that day. It depends on the weather. It depends on the nature of the grass. It depends on all kinds of things. Leadership is like that too. Understanding the culture of an organization, whether you want to change it or not, but understanding that culture is critical. So the first thing a university president has to do is understand what the culture of the institution is like and how much it needs to change. There are about 4,300 state-run and independent universities and colleges in this country. If you add the for-profit sector, that number jumps by about 1,000. This year, enrollment at 34% of that 4,300 did not meet the institution's target. And most institutions are tuition dependent. If you're running a college with 500 people, you can't afford to have 50 people not show up. There are a lot of institutions in the country. You know the Monty Python skit about the dead parrot? There are a lot of dead parrots out there that people keep trying to resuscitate. There's another interesting fact. The total amount of student debt right now, this year, is twice as high as the national credit card debt. This does not sound like a recipe for success. So, that's enough for me. Let Steve talk a little bit to you, and we will try to answer your questions rather than to anticipate what's on your mind. Thank you very much.
As you can imagine, Jerry and I are making book talks together and individually as frequently as possible, with the hope that we'll be able to actually buy some pizzas as a result of the work we put into this book. We had thought about bringing a couple of dozen here, and we have not. But what we have done is gotten you a discount of 20%, and I have a brochure here which tells you about the book and where you can get it. So if you'd like, you can pick those up. I'm only going to speak briefly, just add a little bit of data. And then, frankly, we have discovered, I myself last week in Montreal, and then Jerry and I both in St. Augustine a few days later, that the best way to deal with this is to have you participate. So I'm just going to read you a paragraph from some prepared remarks, and then we'll go directly to questions, which will allow us to turn this into an interactive enterprise. Notwithstanding the fact that you are all captains of industry, and we are merely captains of erudition, there is, in fact, a great overlap. Higher education is not conventionally thought of as an industry, but it is, in fact, it is a major industry in the United States and around the world. Here at home, the number of people enrolled in colleges and universities as students exceeds 20 million, with about 74% attending state schools and about 14.5% enrolled in private, or what we call independent schools. Over 1.5 million people teach at colleges, and an even higher statistic, over more than 2.6 million people are professional staff members. The other day, on the way back from St. Augustine, I stopped off in Columbia, Missouri, which happens to be the residence of one of my sons who teaches at the University of Missouri. And I ended up taking my grandson, who was 7, to the Mizzou-Vanderbilt football game. And I was seated in the chancellor's box, a sort of professional courtesy for old presidents from one to another. And I see they had, at the end zone, some construction going on. And I said, "What are you building over there?" He said, "We're building another extension on the stadium." And I said, "How much is it costing?" And he said, $100 million. And I thought, I'm really glad GW did away with football some years before I came. The many things I didn't want to spend $100 million on would be an extension to the football stadium. I'd like to stop there with the remarks, although I do have some prepared remarks, but it seems to me that Jerry having spoken, now have me speak, is a little bit too much of the same rhetoric. What I'd like to do is see if there are some questions. My guess is, looking at this room, we have a lot of alumni here. A lot of you have degrees, and probably some of you, maybe perhaps many of you, have more than one. And if you don't have degrees, you have children. And if you have children, you're paying, or will be paying, to send them off to get degrees. Let's talk a little bit about what your questions are about the state of American higher education, which is presently in one of the most dynamic and in some ways troubled circumstances of my entire career, with some possible exceptions for the excitement that we went through during the Vietnam War. So, my experience is it's always hard to get the first question, so we'll go directly to the second question. Sir.
Jerry drew a contrast between the private sector and the academy in terms of what the culture's like inside those organizations, and questioned the ability of the academy to prepare people for that transition. Some of that's just human nature. The truth is, there's the same pressure in the private sector. For example, for employees to turn organizations into that serves their personal interests. And it takes leadership to maintain corporate culture and avoid that trend. And so with that in mind, kind of thinking about the university situation, I'm curious as to how a president views making a change in that picture. That for me, I know I kind of have an organizational structure that allows me to delegate and rely on people and the process of making that happen. But if I were a college president, I'm not sure where I would press to change the culture of a university so that it more closely matched the preparation of students for being in that workforce.
My own experience, both successes and failures in changing the culture of universities, and I've led two, GW for 19 years and the University of Hartford in Connecticut for 11, total of 30 years. I think I don't hold a record, but I'm a contender in any case, is that you have to invest yourself, and you have to empower your associates, and you have to bring resources to the game. So, for example, I had a communications department here at GW. Some people would call that journalism. They like to call it communication. And I found that they were really heavily invested in theory and recruiting PhDs to the faculty as colleagues exclusively. And I found that the students who were coming to GW, because it's in Washington and they thought they were going to get close to the heart of communication, were frequently disappointed by all this theory, which prepared them perhaps to go on to become professors at other institutions of communication, but did not, in fact, prepare them very well for the kinds of employment that they were hoping to achieve upon graduation. And so I went to the chairman of the department and said, listen, I've come on a nice elderly lady who would like to give us several $1 million for a new chair, but she has a predisposition for the kind of person she'd like, and I don't think it's an unreasonable one. You have to be very careful with this because you don't want to become the instrument of your benefactors, and if you're perceived as that, you will undermine your academic standing. We've seen some experiences recently at George Mason with that kind of a problem where a benefactor has done undue things in creating the structure of how the money is going to be spent. At any rate, he said, well, he didn't want to participate. And I said, well, that's all right. I said, this woman is very thoughtful, and she's given me total flexibility. So if you don't want to participate in the manner in which we're talking about, I'll simply give the money to sociology or anthropology or somebody else. Well, it turns out that professors, notwithstanding protestations to the contrary, are tropistic. We know of plants. The roots are tropistic to water. The leaves are tropistic to sunlight. So if you put a plant down and the sun is over here, you'll discover after a while that the plant is leaning in this direction. Well, faculty, it turns out, are tropistic to money, just like the rest of us. And so when I said I was moving the money to the anthropology department, that perked them up. and we ultimately went out and recruited a very academically inclined but professional journalist. Actually, you all know him, I think, or you know, at least you know his wife. It's Cokie Roberts' husband, Steve Roberts, who was then leaving the New York Times. And Steve has merely a BA degree from Harvard College. He never went to graduate school. He has no doctorate. Now, he's written half a dozen to 12 books, I can't keep track, frequently with Cokie, and of course has written extensively throughout his entire career. Steve joined us as a professor, and within 2 years, he was the most popular professor in the communication department. Turned out to be a splendid teacher and had a really great commitment to young people, and was a very competitive sort of guy, and had a twin brother who was himself a professor at Harvard, and Steve was determined to become better at the professoring business than his twin brother. Who knows how you compare that kind of thing, but he really threw himself into it. Subsequently, that department was amenable to hiring yet another, Carl Stern, yet another professional who joined the department. And what happened? Immediately, enrollment started picking up in the department, a department which had been sort of flatlined, suddenly opened up. Well, I don't know if that's persuasion, leadership, God only knows, but I can tell you that it transformed that department. But Jerry and I, troubled by many of the administrative problems at the university, tried on a variety of ways to introduce changes which turned out impossible to get the faculty to consider, much less do. Let me give you just one example. That plant over there, the George Washington University plant, worth, I don't know, $2 billion, just to pick a number at random. There is virtually no industry, no business, no commercial enterprise which would allow a facility of that sort to lay fallow May, June, July, and August. And yet we do. When I went to college as an undergraduate, the semester was 15 weeks. Some years ago, and I mean some years ago, we had the oil crisis. In order to save money in the winter, we cut the semesters down to 14 weeks, when it turned out the oil crisis was sort of a blip. We never went back up to 15 weeks. Once you make it smaller, it never gets bigger. And so there are a whole variety of obviously wasteful enterprises in universities that people seem resistant to changing, even though universities are now challenged economically more dramatically than they have ever been in my career. And I think this problem is getting worse. Notwithstanding the $100 million expansion of the football stadium, the president of the University of Missouri, who was hosting me at the football game, had nothing but concerns about the relationship that his university had with the state legislature, which was cutting the budget of the university constantly, driving the tuition up, only to have the university scapegoated for raising its tuition, which it had no control over. Let me stop and
let me give you a couple of other anecdotes. Steve and I, several years ago, wrote a piece for the New York Times op-ed saying, "Look, we ought to have a year-round institution. We ought to be able to have, instead of a 5-course curriculum per semester, a 4-course curriculum." We thought that would increase depth in the catalog. We put together a team of faculty, staff, students, traveled to lots of different institutions that had experimented with a real summer session, and found that after a year's study, that if we moved in those two directions, even after paying all of the additional costs for faculty and staff who would be working in the summer rather than in another term, the university's net would be an additional $10 million. We brought that proposal to the Faculty Senate, which had had members on the committee that was studying this cultural change. How do you think they voted? They voted not to consider the proposal. The only successful stint I had at changing culture was when I worked in the office of the Secretary of Defense. Kind of an odd thing for an former English professor to do, but I did. And I was fortunate enough to work for a secretary and a deputy secretary, spanning a couple of administrations, who really understood that the people who knew most about the jobs they were doing were not the people sitting in the Pentagon, it was the people actually doing those jobs rather than writing policy about them. And we convinced the leadership to try an experiment. Let any installation commander request a waiver from a rule, not a law, but a rule, a policy, that they thought was inhibiting their ability to carry out their mission. And the way the program worked was that no one could say no to those requests except the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Anybody else along the chain could say yes, but nobody else could say no. You wouldn't believe the number of stupid rules that we found that way and the kinds of changes that we're able to make. Give you one example. We were spending billions and billions of dollars a year on travel, mostly for training purposes, not permanent change of station, but you needed to go to a conference like this one. We send you, we hope you learn something, you come back and you apply it, and you had a per diem that you were entitled to. And your per diem told you how much money you could spend for breakfast, how much for lunch, and how much for dinner. It was costing us $3 billion to audit $9 billion worth of travel. And we figured, look, why do I care whether you eat a bigger breakfast and a smaller dinner? Why do I care if you sleep in the park and eat at the Ritz or the other way around? Here's your per diem. You spend it. We get rid of all these nutty rules. The bosses still have to approve the travel and the fact that you went there and learned something. We even found operational rules. We changed the rules for flying InterContinental B-52 missions, which were designed to attack Russia if the need occurred. The only way we found out about those things was from the people who were doing the jobs. And I think in any culture, any leader who isn't listening, yes, you can delegate. You can delegate authority and responsibility. But you cannot possibly know enough about everything going on in your organization. Unless you ask the people who are doing it, how can you do it better? We changed a lot. And I'm here to tell you that it's all changed back under different leadership.
Yes, sir.
Be interested in your thoughts about online learning and the ways in which technology should transform higher education.
I think online learning is going to change whether we like it or not. It makes a great contribution to the academic initiative. I think it is very different in both nature and quality from learning in which there is face-to-face classroom human interaction. I think it will potentially reduce the number of years that students go off to colleges. It will provide educational opportunity to more and more people at different points in their lives, as adults, people who are raising families, people who are traveling for business, people who are working, people who want to have lifelong educational opportunities, continuing legal education, continuing medical education, things of this sort. I do not think we ought to be concerned about the total disappearance of the residential place-based university. We're still going to need centers for scholarship, for research, with laboratories and facilities of that sort. And colleges are not merely what goes on in the classrooms. There are places that people come to go from being, dare I say it, children of 18 to quasi-adults at 21 or 22, and learn to both work and live with other people, to accommodate to other people, and to go through, frankly, courtship rituals and a whole variety of other things that take place in the university, perhaps including behaving irresponsibly from time to time. So I think what we have is a new tool, and we're going to get to know how to use it better and better as time goes on. Those of you who are older will remember the early days of teaching through the use of television. And you see examples of that going on. I was in China, got up to get dressed in the morning, turned on the television set, and there was somebody giving me an English lesson. And apparently there are Chinese who get up every morning and do an hour of English on watching a television show before they go off to their jobs. There are all sorts of things like that which I think are going to be opportunities that we didn't have, a generation or two ago. And there will be further innovations that I can't begin to imagine, and that will make that tool ever more useful. But people who I think are worried about the disappearance of colleges and universities are probably a little premature.
There's another part to this. The best book on higher education I've read this year is not ours. It's one called Robot Proofing the Curriculum. And saying there are things that you actually can't teach online or by television in these ways. You cannot teach creativity, you cannot teach empathy, you cannot teach entrepreneurship with artificial intelligence. So there are still things that colleges and universities can do if they're willing to transform the requirements, the basic requirements, and also to collaborate. For example, Physics 101 ought to be Physics 101 no matter where you take it. I mean, there's a certain number of formulas you need to understand, you need to be able to apply them, and so on. Yet we have almost no collaboration among departments of physics. There's no one that says this is what the curriculum ought to be like. Maybe that's good, maybe it's not good. But even in teaching English literature, which I used to do, and I love doing it, I had to spend a lot of time teaching things like rhyme schemes, and this is a sonnet, and this is an elegy. And, there's a nomenclature. There are things that do not change. There's the foundation on which you build your ability to understand English literature. Computers could do this better than I could 50 years ago. But we've never done that. We could transform what takes place in the classroom if we relied on the assistance of technology to teach these fundamentals and spend more of our time teaching the kinds of things that machines and things cannot teach. A question back here.
Well, thank you for hosting this. Thank you for being here for the book, and thank you, CED, for hosting this. I'm Jill Welchum with NAFSA, Association of International Educators. We've done a lot with you, Dr. Trachtenberg, over the years. I'm very interested in what was said earlier about business and society being the consumers of the output of higher ed institutions, and I'm interested in what you and others in the room think about what kind of leadership is needed at the higher ed institution to have global leadership for our citizens who come out of these institutions. And so just this week, new data came out that international students, new enrollments for international students are down 6.6%. So while you see this tiny increase in the 1 million+ students in the country, it's because they're staying after they graduate to do optional practical training, the pipeline is drying up. And that's due to global competition, it's due to our political environment, it's due to our tuition costs, it's due to a lot of things, and just increasing competition abroad. But I'm really curious what industry and what higher ed could do, given how valuable the presence of international students are to our research, our industry, and it's $39 billion, and it's full tuition, and it's driving innovation in science. So what have you learned about that? My thinking is that the kind of leadership that's needed isn't just about setting the campus up as international, it's about taking leadership and advocating with policymakers. I think it goes outside the campus, but what are your thoughts?
Within the last 24 hours, the Angel Cabrera, the president of George Mason, had a piece in the Washington Post expressing concern about the decline of international students coming to the United States. After 9/11, the United States, fearful, and perhaps rightly so, restricted the admission of international students to the United States. I was then serving as president of GW and discovered that this was hitting us directly in the pocketbook because as a major international university located here in the District of Columbia, we have a very consequential portion of our enrollment coming from abroad. So I went to see an alumnus of ours, a gentleman by the name of Colin Powell, who at the time was the Secretary of State. And he said, well, listening to my problem, he said, Stephen, he said, you need to get some allies in addressing this problem and to make it more broad than just universities. So I went to see Ted Kennedy, who I knew from my days as a vice president at Boston University, and I told him the problem, and he laughed and he said, just before you came into the office, I had somebody here from the Cape Cod Hotel Association. And it turns out every summer, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of young Irish kids like to come to the United States and work in the hotels on Cape Cod and Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket. And they can't get into the country, and this is having a major impact on the hotel industry in my state. So tell me what I'm supposed to do. And so we got him to write a letter to the Secretary of State expressing some concern about what was going on, and we ultimately got a solution. But a residual of that occasion never went away, and what had happened, of course, is when the United States closed its doors, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, and other English-speaking countries saw an opportunity and opened their doors, and students who had almost exclusively come to the United States when they wanted to study English and they wanted higher education started going to these other countries. Now, we had significantly recovered from that over the intervening years, but the problem is now returning, and it's returning because of a concern that international students have about the potential hospitality of the United States higher education institutions to their enrollment. And we're seeing fewer students coming from the Middle East, and we're seeing fewer students coming from our major supplier, which is China, and also India. That's what prompted President Cabrera to write his piece. But I see this increasing around the country, where international students are declining, and this I think will be a bad thing for the United States, both in terms of the welfare and health of its institutions of higher education, the opportunities that American students have to make friends and develop relationships with international students. And frankly, I think we're being very short-sighted, and one can only hope that people like yourself and the sitting university presidents who have access to senators and congressmen in their respective states will call this to the attention of the White House and and change the message that is being sent to young people around the country about the United States as a potential place to go to graduate school and undergraduate school. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I wanted to go back to your point that you made at the end of your opening statement about student debt, which is extraordinary, and what that means for inequality here in the United States, immobility of our workforce, which requires special skills that are not being filled, and what it means, particularly now that we are getting a drop, is so eloquently explained, in international funds that were coming in to deal with the challenges that the universities themselves are having, given the choices that they're making on what they spend. And I'm wondering if you can kind of tie this debt issue together with some of the other challenges that CED deals with, both workforce and our ability really to stay in the technological lead as a nation.
Well, debt, I tell students all the time, is the new slavery. Mm-hmm. And to the extent that you overburden yourself with debt, you inhibit your future. You lose the ability to buy homes and take jobs that are interesting but perhaps don't pay as well as others, a variety of shortcomings that result. That said, it's less of a problem than it may appear. The problem is not so much the need to borrow. The problem is that students are badly advised about where they go to college and how they go to finance it. So, for example, as I mentioned earlier, I've just come back from Missouri, where my son teaches at the University of Missouri. And I've discovered that it is possible, if you're a Missouri resident, to go to the University of Missouri at a very modest tuition. I think it's important to us not to get misled by the prices, not the costs, the prices of tuition at Ivy League institutions. You take all the 8 Ivy League institutions, their enrollment is less than that of Michigan State alone. So what you've got here are some high visibility, elite institutions which are very expensive, at least their posted prices. Most of them have significant scholarship and fee-cutting arrangements for students who are clever enough to apply. I think many students are badly advised at the secondary school level and have options that they're not aware of. Look, if you're a resident of Virginia and you can get into the University of Virginia or Virginia State or William and Mary, you'll be going to institutions that are as good as any universities on the planet. And you can do it at a relatively modest price to parents or tuition payers. It is not obligatory that everybody go to institutions that cost $50,000 a year. I just recently gave some advice to an alumnus of GW who is a lawyer in Las Vegas. And he has a modest practice. We could call him middle class. And he has twins. And the 2 twins are very bright. They wanted to go to school together. And they got into Duke. And Duke didn't give them any financial aid. And the 2 boys got into University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And they wanted them so badly that they waived all tuition. The question then became Duke or UNLV. The father calls me up and asks for some advice, and I said, 2 boys concurrently at Duke, no financial aid, you're going to come out with $400,000, $500,000 worth of debt. Frankly, I take a very hard look at the University of Nevada and consider at the end of the process that you'll have saved whatever that tuition is going to be. Your kids are going to have a perfectly fine bachelor's degree, and they're probably going to go on to graduate school, and you're going to have the money to be able to send them on to graduate school and medical school or law school. And we're starting to see breakthroughs. I don't know if you saw the news, quite remarkable the other day from New York University.
Absolutely.
Right?
Having paid for medical school for my daughter, I said, why did she go to Columbia? Why not NYU?
That's right. That's right. That's right. So I think we're starting to see some breakthroughs. You know, when my wife went to Brooklyn College, it was $25 a year, and that was the gym fee.
But the issue I wanted to hear was the debt that this ball and chain that large for years that is creating, I think, the immobility and a real concern. That to me is how do we, as a nation, what should we do about that?
There are
the existing debt.
A couple of answers. There are programs that allow debt relief if you go into certain occupations. I hope you'll forgive me if I say this administration has slow-walked every one of those opportunities. There are people who thought that their tuition was and their debt was going to be remitted, and now it's not. It hasn't happened. I think that the targeted relief was very important because it just does harmonize with the efforts to get the right kinds of students in the right places for the economy that we can see coming. And that's not unusual. We had the National Defense Act years and years ago, So, the government has done this before. We missed a huge opportunity in the 70s. The man for whom Steve and I both worked at different times, president of Boston University, a notorious fellow named John Silver, proposed as follows. Let's set up a federal bank, essentially, that you will borrow from in order to pay your college expenses, and you will pay it back by paying 10% additional on your income tax until the point where you have paid back 150% of what you borrowed. But why 150? Because there will be people who cannot make that debt, and the number showed about 150 would be right, including inflation. It would have cost not very much to capitalize that back then. Had we done that, we wouldn't have the problem we do now. But the changing political attitudes toward the federal how much responsibility does the federal government have? It depends how you're asking. Is it a mandatory expenditure? No, it's a discretionary expenditure. But it's also an investment. And the federal budget is not terrific at making investments, except in things where they can see a very quick return.
One of the great philosophical questions as being raised by this is who is the beneficiary of a college education? Is it the individual who is being educated, or is it our society, which has subsequently the benefit of that person's life and endeavors? And historically, the view was that society was the beneficiary, which explained why we give free elementary, secondary, and in the old days, higher education. It may be coming back. I mean, it seemed to me that some of the promises made by Democratic candidates in the last national election, Bernie Sanders most particularly, but I think Hillary Clinton was moving in that direction as well, to provide free education, free higher education to everybody once again, was perhaps excessive. I don't think the numbers were crunched sufficiently, and I don't think the country really had the capacity. On the other hand, to become more accommodating and to find ways, such as the one Jerry just mentioned and others, clearly is something that our society needs to be taking a look at, and we're starting to see some of that in individual states. New York now is providing some of those opportunities, and others. So I think the issue is clearly on the American agenda. Whether we'll address it in this administration or we'll have to wait for a while is not clear. I don't see a great sympathy for these kinds of changes in the current administration. But frankly, if the people speak, almost any administration is going to pay some attention. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I kind of like to tie the last two questions together in terms of, as you mentioned, higher education is now an industry, and welcome to an industry with overcapacity and increasing international competition. And again, back to the tuition point that you mentioned, it is the critical element of cost to the deployment of the product. And again, it's a convoluted situation. As you mentioned in your Nevada example, I have very close relationships with the development people at Clemson University, and they freely admit there is not a single in-state student in South Carolina that's paying the full in-state published tuition for attending Clemson University. And the other thing is the export, both domestically and internationally, of higher education. 30 years ago, the Clemson non-South Carolina population would have been under 10%. Today it's approaching 50, and the international export of higher education has, to almost everyone's opinion, been hugely underpriced relative to what the world market for higher education is. And it's all because it all gets rolled up into that tuition nut that nobody but the administrators and the trustees of the university knows how that ball all comes up to the total budget of the university.
We heard a presentation at St. Augustine from a college in Iowa. It's, I think, one of those dead parrots, but they don't think so. Their tuition discount from the sticker price to what people were actually paying was 80%. Furthermore, they thought that the way to repair their enrollment deficit was to enroll more international students because they're full payers. How many people do you think abroad are going to choose Iowa Wesleyan as their destination, especially in the present climate where we are restricting access to the United States and making it difficult for people to come here? I think when you're reduced to measures like that, you don't have much of a hope of existing more than another year or so. But I want to go back to the question on the international education. I think there are a couple of parts to it that we haven't mentioned yet. The first, as you'll see in the book, when we did ask presidents to write about curriculum, the only thing that the two of them chose to write about, one from Vassar, one from Goucher, was study abroad, mandatory study abroad for American students at genuine programs, not the ones we see so often, which are just glorified tourism without much academic rigor, but real academic rigor. The other thing I'd like to mention, again, is from the Defense Department. As many of you are probably well aware, we do a great deal of education in the Defense Department, not just off at the college level, but professional military education, the command and staff schools and the war colleges. Every one of those enrolls international students and has for years, because we hope that we will build understanding and cooperation. Now, they've been challenged because the current administration wants them to cut back on that. But I think it has proved its worth time and time again over the last few years to deliberately include international students into the classes and curriculum.
I think we have time for maybe one more question, but one question I'd like to ask is that, former CED trustee Donna Shalala, who was the president of the University of Wisconsin and then University of Miami, and just got elected to Congress. So Donna sat in this very room with a trustee meeting when the University of Miami. And there was a quarterback controversy going on at the school. And she said, anybody in this room asking me about it, I'm walking out. She walked out of there and there were reporters found out that she was here in the hotel, tracking her down to talk to her about the quarterback controversy. And then I'm reminded of this recent issue with the University of Maryland, where you had the football coach and the president, you know, that whole mess there. I guess my final question for you is that with the pressures of athletics and what a moneymaker that makes for universities, I mean, how does that impact your leadership?
Well, it's obviously very consequential. And you see presidents losing their jobs over it. And you see presidents chewed up by the political controversy. Look, let me put it a different way, simply and with numbers. I served 30 years as a university president. I don't know if I could do that today. We had the average tenure of a university president up around 8.5, 9 years. It is now declining, and it is about 6 years now. And with that kind of turnover, you're not going to build strong, great institutions. I mentioned earlier that my son is a professor at the University of Missouri. You'll recall a couple of years ago when a controversy arose in which the president and the chancellor of the university stepped down within a few days of each other. You can imagine that that institution was rudderless for a while. Applications by Missouri residents declined dramatically, and that affected the budget. The legislature, upset with what had happened at the campus, cut the appropriation to the university, and that had a negative effect. Now they're coming back, but universities are impacted by almost all the things that take place in our society. So if we are a society that has issues about race, if we're a society that has issues about gender, if we're a society that has issues about sex, pick your topic, you'll find them in the university, and you'll find that they will rile the institutions, and that will affect the leadership of the institution's ability to stay on as president. We see seasoned political people, people who have been cabinet officers, people who have been senators, who go on to become university presidents and fail at those jobs, notwithstanding their skill set. We see presidents in the Maryland case where a competent president is undermined by his board of trustees. If you like contact sport, keep an eye on higher education. You'll find it as exciting as any other. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier the importance of education. It seems to be going back to its relevance relative to the national interests and our interests of society. But we've also launched now over a good period of time where the academy has moved tremendously towards a progressive state, and in doing so has coddled students and at the same time has rejected a lot of the basic fundamental rights of free expression. And there hasn't been any discussion on that. I'm wondering, a lot of people, certainly half the country probably, would question the relevance of education today, especially when we look at it on the social side of our society.
Yes, those are people who send their own kids on to colleges. Nevertheless, they may be critical of what's going on in colleges and universities, but they don't expect their own sons and daughters to make it in America in the 21st century without having something beyond a high school diploma. So I'm unimpressed by that, and frankly, I think I am as concerned as anybody about free speech on campus. I am as concerned as anybody about all the issues that are troubling people about universities. I don't argue that universities are perfect and not in need of remediation in a variety of ways. But I think it's also excessively and more dramatically articulated in the media. I'm starting to sound like President Trump here. Than is absolutely accurate, and it makes good copy, and it's interesting. But there is more free speech going on our campuses than people would ever believe if they only read the newspapers. Bad news: train wrecks. People stop to watch. In fact, if you look at what's going on our campuses, GW right down the street, we've got speakers from every conceivable point of view appearing on the campus on a regular basis. Students are arguing about Israel and Palestine on a regular basis. There is, in fact, a great deal of free speech on campus. Sometimes it's a cacophony. And I think that the concern about it is something that speaks well of us as a society, but we ought not be overdramatic about it.
Without being overdramatic.
I don't mean you, I mean...
Yeah, without being overdramatic.
Yeah.
How do you justify the whole concept of safe zones and that students have today? I mean, I teach at a major research university.
Yes.
And you see it all the time. You see students that don't want to accept both of two points of view, and a faculty that doesn't. If you look at, overwhelmingly, if you look at what the faculty political leanings are, they are overwhelmingly not representative of society.
I'm not sure that's wholly accurate. It tends to vary by discipline. In the hard sciences and in engineering, you find a lot of people who are more conservative than liberal. That's not true in the humanities departments necessarily, but they all work together. I mean, I don't see this tension so much within faculties as coming from outside. I think that people teach apolitically for the most part. We're not in the business of converting people. We're in the business of educating people, and that's what we try to do. I think you've had your hand up for some time.
I'm sorry I'm late. We still counting ballots, of course. I am concerned about overall teaching critical thinking, which we don't seem to have a lot in this country. And it's especially needed as we have to sort through the fake and the real and all the kind of news. But I'm also concerned that we may not be fostering enough innovation in schools. For example, the Universal Studio engineers have developed games, video games, that can teach higher math better than someone standing there lecturing to you. Senator Day O'Connor introduced games to teach civics, okay? And kids love that, okay? But I'm just saying, is there anybody that, I think especially at the community college level, where we teach so many of our students, really taking a rein on saying, how do we teach really critical skills like critical thinking, like innovation, like creativity? That is a competitive edge that we have historically had as a country.
Again, let me refer to that, Becca. I think you'd love it. It's called robot-proofing the curriculum. And Joe Aoun, who's the president of Northeastern University, is the one who wrote that. And he's one of the more innovative and creative presidents. And I think you'll enjoy reading it because I think he has some answers to those questions.
I don't want to minimize your concerns because I think they're real. I just think that they have been made excessively. And that, yes, there are students who want safe spaces, and yes, there are a variety of things that you and I might be critical of, maybe even ridicule. For those reasons, my wife tells me that I've gotten older and I ought not ever consider going back to being a university president. She claims I wouldn't be able to make it in the current environment. But I most earnestly believe that those issues make very good copy. There are some university presidents who have handled it very badly, and so it's become even more entertaining in its way, and I mean that in a critical manner, not in a lighthearted manner. Again, I think if you look at the substance of most of the universities and what's going on the campuses, you'd be most gratified that a great deal is being done that's largely good.
We're going to have to end there. I want to thank Steve and Gerald for being here. Thank you so much.